dusty corner of the old library, hidden behind stacks of forgotten books and fading scrolls, lay a single, weathered diary. Its leather cover was cracked, stained with age, but the contents inside were far more dangerous than the passage of time could ever diminish. No one was supposed to find it, and yet it had remained undisturbed for generations. But tonight, the forbidden pages would reveal a secret that would change everything. It wasn't an accident that the diary had been concealed so carefully. It was placed there, hidden within the shelves, intentionally sealed away from prying eyes. Its owner, a woman of great influence, whose name had been erased from the annals of history, had taken every measure to ensure its secrecy. But secrets, as they always do, have a way of revealing themselves. When I first stumbled across the diary, I had no idea what it contained. I had been working late in the library, combing through records, seeking out a story that had long eluded me. I'd heard whispers of an ancient family secret, a story that had been passed down through generations, hushed tones in darkened corners, half-formed truths spoken only when the moon was high in the sky, the kind of story that made even the bravest shiver. But I wasn't afraid. I thought it was just another legend, another dark tale meant to unsettle the mind. I was wrong. At first, I thought it was just another old journal, one of many that lined the shelves of that ancient library. Its pages, yellowed with age, seemed innocuous enough. I was prepared to catalogue it with the others, to leave it for someone else to uncover, but something about it caught my attention. The way the leather creaked as I opened the cover, the faint scent of jasmine and decay that lingered in the air. It felt alive, almost as though the pages were calling to me. The first few lines were innocuous, filled with the usual ramblings of a person long gone, but as I turned the pages, a chill ran down my spine. The handwriting was erratic, as though the author had been in a hurry, desperate to record every word before time ran out. There were no dates, no names, only cryptic messages that grew darker with each passing page. It was as if the writer knew something terrible was coming, but they could not escape it. The words were filled with a sense of urgency. Every entry seemed to lead into the next, with an almost painful sense of inevitability. It wasn't just a diary, it was a confession that no one was meant to read. And the deeper I went into its pages, the clearer it became that the truth inside was not something that could be easily ignored. The more I read, the more I understood the true power of what I had uncovered. One passage, in particular, stood out. It was written in a hurried, almost frantic scrawl. The diary must never be opened. They will come for it, and they will come for you. The secret is buried deep within, and once it is exposed, there is no turning back. I have made a terrible mistake, and now, I fear it is too late for me to stop it. At first I dismissed it as nothing more than the paranoid musings of a madwoman, but as I read further, it became clear that this wasn't just an ordinary diary. This was a record of something far darker, something that had been hidden for centuries. As I turned the pages, I found entries that described strange occurrences, whispers in the night, shadows moving in the corners of rooms, objects that seemed to vanish and reappear when no one was looking. But these weren't the delusions of a fractured mind. They were warnings of something ancient and powerful that had been unleashed, something that could not be contained once it had been set free. The more I read, the more I realized that the secret hidden within this diary wasn't just a story. It was a curse that had been passed down through generations of the writer's family, a family whose name had been intentionally erased from history. But despite their efforts, the curse could never truly be erased. It was a part of them, a part of the bloodline that could not be severed, no matter how hard they tried. There were passages about rituals, ancient symbols, and forbidden knowledge, things that had been lost to time, things that were never meant to be known. The writer spoke of their family's role in the ancient rituals, their involvement in dark practices that were meant to harness powers beyond comprehension, powers that were never meant to be controlled. But in their arrogance, they believed they could. And now, the price of that belief was coming due. The entries grew increasingly erratic, as if the writer was losing their mind, consumed by guilt and fear. The last few pages were almost illegible, written in a frenzy, as though the writer was trying to escape something or someone who was chasing them. And then there was a final entry. "It's coming. They have found me, but the diary must not fall into the wrong hand. If you are reading this, you have already made a grave mistake. I only pray that you can stop it before it's too late." The diary ended there. No further words, just silence. But that silence was deafening. I knew then that I had uncovered something I wasn't meant. I had opened the door to a dark, terrifying world. A world filled with secrets that had been buried for a reason, and now, there was no going back. But what was the secret? What had this family done that was so terrible? What had they uncovered, that they had to hide it at all costs? These were the questions that haunted me as I closed the diary. I couldn't just leave it alone, not after what I had read. There was only one thing left to do: go deeper, to find out more. And whatever I discovered, I knew one thing for certain: the truth behind this forbidden diary would not be easily forgotten. The moment I closed the diary, I felt a weight settle on my shoulders, a sensation unlike anything I had ever experienced, as if the pages themselves had taken root within me, planting a seed of curiosity that would consume me until I uncovered every detail hidden between those brittle covers. I spent the following days in a frenzy, trying to make sense of the cryptic entry, the name of the writer, the family they spoke of, and the mysterious curse they had warned about. They were all just pieces of a much larger puzzle. Every lead I chased seemed to dead end in the same place: unanswered questions and broken histories. The more I searched, the more I realized that the records I needed to understand this family had been deliberately erased, as if someone had been working tirelessly to bury the truth. I couldn't ignore the fact that the diary spoke of rituals, forbidden knowledge, and powers that should never have been tampered with. But the thing that struck me the most was the family's obsession with control over knowledge, over life and death itself. They had unlocked something ancient and dark, and had thought themselves powerful enough to harness it. But as the diary warned, no one was ever meant to control such forces. It was during one of my late-night searches through old manuscripts that I stumbled upon the first clue. Hidden within the pages of a much older text, I found a mention of a family. Though the name had been smudged out, I could barely make it out. But the letters were unmistakable. Ashford. It didn't match the name in the diary, but there was something about it that seemed eerily familiar. My heart raced as I read further. The entry described the Ashford family's influence over a small but prosperous region in the 17th century. But what really caught my attention was the mention of a ritual site, hidden beneath one of their estates, a place that had been marked as sacred long before the Ashfords arrived. The entry was vague, but the words bloodline and legacy were used in a context that resonated with the words from the diary. Whoever wrote this entry had no intention of making the connection to the Ashford family, but their actions spoke volume. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was getting closer, but still I was left with more questions than answers. The more I pieced together the fragments, the clearer it became that the Ashford family wasn't just a historical anomaly. They were the key to everything. It wasn't until I discovered a series of old letters that the pieces began to click into place. The letters, written between 1821 and 1823, were in the same erratic handwriting as the diary, and they spoke of the family's deepening descent into madness. One letter in particular stood out. It was written by the patriarch of the family, Edward Ashford. The writing was frenzied, almost panicked, and it confirmed everything I had feared. "We've opened the door," the letter read. "The ritual was a mistake. The power we sought to control has a mind of its own, and now it will not be ignored. It moves within us, and we cannot stop it. I've seen it in my children, in their eyes, and it is too late. The family line is cursed, and I fear that we are its origin." The letter was signed with a single line: "Save them before it's too late." The words were chilling. I could no longer dismiss the notion of some supernatural force driving the Ashford family's action. Their search for power had not only corrupted their own bloodline, but had unleashed something far more sinister, and that thing, whatever it was, had latched onto them, feeding off their obsession and their fear. I felt a growing urgency. This was no longer just about uncovering a forgotten family secret. This was about understanding the terrible force that had consumed them. A force that could very well be still at work today. The diary, the letters, and the cryptic warnings were only the beginning. But there was one part of the puzzle I hadn't fully explored. The family's estate, the place where it all began. The Ashford estate was located in a remote part of England, surrounded by dense forests and steep hills. It had been abandoned for over a century, but its legacy lingered in the local folklore. People whispered about the ruins, about strange sounds heard at night, and about the occasional flickering light that could be seen from the window. The stories were always the same, dark, twisted, and filled with dread. Locals avoided the area, convinced that something evil still haunted the grounds. I knew then that I had to go. I had to see it for myself, to step inside the place that had given birth to this family's curse. But it wasn't just curiosity that drove me. It was a sense of responsibility. I had uncovered the diary for a reason, and I couldn't let its secrets die with me. The journey to the estate was long and arduous. The landscape grew more desolate, the closer I got to the ruins, as though nature itself was trying to keep me away. I arrived just before dusk, the sky turning a deep, unsettling shade of purple. The estate loomed before me, its crumbling walls and shattered windows, standing like a monument to the past. I stepped over the threshold, and immediately I felt it, an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of history, and every step I took seemed to echo through the halls. The estate was silent, but it wasn't empty. It was as if the walls themselves were watching me, waiting for something. I made my way through the ruined halls, my flashlight casting long shadows across the walls. The place felt suffocating, as though it were holding its breath. The remnants of furniture, old portraits hanging crooked on the walls, and faded tapestries all told the same story. The story of a family that had once lived here, a family that had succumbed to the darkness they had unleashed. And then I found it, the door to the basement. It was old, the wood warped and splintered, but it wasn't locked. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the cold handle. I wasn't sure what I expected to find down there, but I knew I had to go. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with dust and decay. As I descended the creaky stairs, the beam of my flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I reached the bottom, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the room was an old stone altar, covered in dust and cobwebs. There were markings carved into the walls, symbols I recognized from the diary, the same symbols that had been described in the ritual passages. And in the center of the altar was a single object, a small glass jar, covered in a thick layer of grime. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, yet it seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. I knew in that moment that I had found the final piece of the puzzle. The object in the jar, the one the Ashford family had used in their rituals, was still here, and whatever it contained was far more dangerous than anything I had imagined. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and as I did, I heard something behind me, a whisper, soft but unmistakable. "It's too late." The voice sent a shiver down my spine. I turned, but no one was there. I wasn't alone. I stood frozen in the darkness of the basement, the glass jar in my hands, feeling the weight of history in the cool, damp air. The whispering voice had come from nowhere, and the silence that followed was deafening. My heart raced, and I instinctively glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the room was as empty as it had been when I first entered. The jar felt cold against my skin, its surface smooth and almost alive. I didn't want to touch it, but something inside me urged me to. I could sense that whatever it contained, it wasn't just an artifact. It was a piece of the Ashford family's dark legacy, a legacy tied to the very land beneath my feet. I took a deep breath, and slowly unscrewed the jar's lid. The air shifted around me, as if the very atmosphere in the room was holding its breath. When I opened the jar, a chill swept through the basement, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. For a moment, I thought I saw something move inside the jar, but when I looked closer, there was nothing but a faint, swirling mist. I leaned in closer, my curiosity getting the best of me. The mist began to coalesce, slowly forming a shape, a shadow, faint, but unmistakable. It was as if the jar itself was trying to tell me something, trying to pull me deeper into the mystery that had been buried here for centuries. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me,
and I stumbled backward, dropping the jar onto the stone floor. The mist inside seemed to pulse, as if it had a life of its own, rising from the jar and swirling around me like an ethereal fog. I could hear whispers, faint at first, but growing louder. The words were unintelligible, a language I couldn't place, but I understood the tone. A warning, a cry for help. I stumbled back toward the stairs, my feet tripping over the loose stones in the floor. The whispers grew louder, as if someone was trying to reach me. But before I could make it to the stairs, I heard a sound behind me, a loud, sharp crack. The air in the basement shifted again, and I turned just in time to see the shadows in the corner of the room darken and move, as if something was taking shape.
I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The mist seemed to coalesce into a figure, tall and indistinct, cloaked in shadows. I could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, toward the altar where the jar had been. As it did, the air grew colder, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the stairs as I ascended the narrow stairwell. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The voice was back, louder now, more insistent. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a chant, a rhythmic chant that echoed in my mind, pulling me towards something I couldn't explain. I burst out of the basement door and into the hall. The house felt different now, more oppressive, like it was alive and aware of my presence. I stumbled through the darkened halls, my flashlight flickering, and finally found my way to the front door. I didn't stop to look around. I just shoved open the door and ran into the night. As I stood on the estate's grounds, gasping for breath, I glanced back at the mansion. The windows were dark, but I could have sworn I saw movement behind them, a figure standing at the window, watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that I wasn't alone. Even though the estate was supposed to be abandoned, I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from the house, from the curse that had followed me. It wasn't until I reached the local inn that I allowed myself to stop and think. I collapsed onto the bed, my body shaking, my mind racing. What had I uncovered? What was it that had been unleashed on the Ashford family? And why had it been buried in the first place? I had to know more. I spent the next few days scouring every archive I could find in the nearby village. The Ashford estate's history was littered with gaps, and the local residents refused to speak about it. But eventually I found a journal, buried deep within the walls of an old library, that seemed to hold the answers. It was written by a man named Jonathan Ashford, a distant relative of the original family, who had returned to the estate in 1832. His writings were not dissimilar to the diary I had found, but they were far more disturbing. Jonathan spoke of his family's obsession with an ancient artifact, one that had been passed down through generations. He described it as a powerful relic, something that could grant the Ashfords control over death itself. It was a dark, forbidden secret, one that the family had sought to protect at any cost. But Jonathan's account painted a different picture. The artifact had not brought them power. It had brought them ruin. As I read further, I realized that Jonathan's writings were not just a family history. They were a warning about the curse that had consumed them, the curse that had spread through every Ashford bloodline, a curse that had now found its way into my hand. In the final pages of the journal, Jonathan described an encounter he had with something or someone that he called the Keeper. He said that the Keeper had told him that the Ashford family was bound to the artifact, forever linked to it. The curse would not stop until it had claimed every last member of their bloodline, and the artifact itself had to remain locked away, hidden from the world. Jonathan's last words were a chilling plea. I have seen the darkness. Do not release it. Do not let it walk again. But I had already released it. I had opened the jar, and now, whatever was inside was free. The Ashford curse was no longer just history. It was real, and it was hunting me. The curse was not just a relic of the past. It was alive, and it had chosen me as its next victim.
I couldn't escape, and the more I tried to uncover, the more I realized that the answers I sought might be the very thing that destroyed me. I had a choice to bury the truth once again, or to face whatever lay hidden within the Ashford legacy. But deep down, I knew there was no turning back now. The events that followed my discovery were like a blur, fragments of memories, emotions that shifted between terror and disbelief. Every night, I would lie awake, listening to the creaks of the house, wondering if the whispers were still in the air, still creeping into my thoughts. The curse of the Ashford family wasn't something that could be contained, not even by the weight of centuries. It was alive, and it was searching for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. No matter where I went, no matter how far I tried to escape, the presence of the Ashford family lingered. The estate seemed to have left its mark on me, as though the walls had absorbed something far darker than any history I had been able to uncover. But the more I tried to avoid thinking about it, the more it consumed me. I started revisiting the journals, piecing together what had once been lost. That's when I realized something that sent a cold chill through my spine. The curse wasn't just bound to the family's bloodline. It was a trap that had been set by time itself. The key to understanding the curse lay within the artifact. It had been passed down through generations, its origins shrouded in mystery, but what I discovered in the final pages of Jonathan Ashford's journal was the truth, a truth too horrifying to comprehend. The artifact had never been meant for power. It was never about control. It was a vessel, a prison, and the family had been guarding it, not to wield its strength, but to keep it locked away. The last entry in Jonathan's journal was written in a frantic hand, the ink smeared as if he had been writing in haste. He spoke of a prophecy, one that had been passed down through the Ashford line for centuries. It was a prophecy of a family cursed to remain trapped within their own bloodline, bound to the artifact for eternity. But the artifact's power was not in what it could do, it was in what it could contain. And the worst part, the artifact wasn't just an object. It was a doorway to something far worse than I had ever imagined. The next few days were spent in isolation. I couldn't bear to tell anyone what I had discovered. No one would believe me, not without seeing the journal for themselves, not without understanding the depth of the Ashford family's dark past. I was alone in this, and deep down, I realized that I might always be alone in it. I found myself returning to the mansion, drawn to it by some force I couldn't explain. I had to know what was inside. I had to understand what had happened to the family, what they had done to themselves, and to the generations that came after. The house was as silent as ever, but I knew that the silence was only a mask, hiding the terrible truth. I opened the door to the basement once more, the air heavy with the scent of decay. But this time, I wasn't just exploring. I was searching for something, for any hint, any clue that could reveal what had truly happened. I descended into the darkness, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on me with every step. The basement was the same as before, dark, cold, and filled with the remnants of a family that had once been. But as I walked deeper into the room, something caught my eye, a glimmer of light, faint but steady. I followed it, drawn toward the corner where the old wooden chest had once stood. There in the same spot was another jar, but this one was different. It was smaller, its surface smooth and unmarked. As I reached for it, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The jar felt warm to the touch, as though it had been waiting for me. I hesitated, my hand hovering above the lid. Should I open it? Should I risk whatever was inside, knowing what it might release? But I couldn't stop myself. The lure of the mystery was too strong. I had to know. I twisted the lid, and as it came free, a cold wind blew through the basement, extinguishing my lantern. The room was plunged into darkness. I could hear the whispering again, louder this time, closer. It was no longer a murmur. It was a chant, a language I didn't understand, but somehow knew. I felt the air grow thick around me, pressing in, suffocating. Something was here, something that had been waiting for centuries, and it was reaching for me. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. There was silence, but it was a different kind of silence. It was oppressive, suffocating. And then, I felt it, a presence, an overwhelming force pressing against me, pulling at me. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, and I turned, desperate to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The walls closed in, the shadows growing darker, more alive. I had opened the jar, and now there was no turning back. I woke up hours later, back in the inn. My body ached, my mind clouded with confusion. What had happened? I had opened the jar, but nothing had come out. Or had it? I couldn't remember. But as I lay there, trying to piece together the events, I realized one thing. The curse wasn't just a story, it was real, and it was hunting me. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences only grew. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadows, the whispers, the figure standing in the corner of the room. The Ashford family was no longer a history. They were a presence that would follow me wherever I went. I had released the curse, and now I would pay the price. There was no escaping it, and the worst part, the family hadn't disappeared from history. They were still there, waiting for the moment when the last piece of their legacy would be revealed. The door to the mansion was open now, and soon, it would be my turn to step inside once more. It was impossible to escape the feeling that something had been left undone, something essential buried within the walls of the Ashford mansion. The deeper I ventured into my investigation, the more I began to realize that this wasn't merely a haunting. It was a warning left behind for anyone who dared to pry into the family's darkest secrets. I spent days trying to make sense of the jar, the whispers, and the terrifying presence that followed me wherever I went, but nothing could prepare me for what I discovered beneath the mansion. I had believed that the family's curse had simply trapped them in their own bloodline, keeping them bound to an unholy legacy. I couldn't have been more wrong. The truth was far darker than I had ever imagined. It was a cold, foggy morning when I made my way back to the mansion. The eerie quiet of the surrounding landscape only heightened the feeling of foreboding that had begun to gnaw at me. I had no real plan. I wasn't sure what I was looking for anymore, but something deep inside told me that the answers I sought were hidden beneath the mansion's foundation. The mansion itself was as imposing as ever, its dark windows reflecting the cloudy sky above. The rusted gates creaked in the wind, as though warning me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had come this far, and I couldn't stop now. I made my way around the back of the property, slipping past the overgrown hedges and crumbling stonework. The mansion's rear entrance was hidden in shadow, but I had spent enough time studying its architecture to know where to go. It was through this forgotten door that I had first ventured into the mansion's deepest secrets. Now, I was about to uncover the one thing that the Ashford family had gone to great lengths to hide. I reached the basement door again, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The air inside was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. It was colder than I remembered, the temperature dropping sharply as I descended into the darkness. The silence pressed in on me, suffocating, as though the mansion itself were holding its breath. The lantern flickered in my hand as I made my way down the familiar stone steps. The shadows seemed to dance around me, growing larger, more menacing. I didn't dare speak. If the whispers were still there, I didn't want to hear them. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw the familiar old chest, the same one I had seen when I first ventured down into the basement. But this time, there was something different about it. It wasn't just it was a doorway to something far more sinister than I could have imagined. I approached it cautiously, my fingers trembling as I reached for the latch. The chest was heavy, its wood groaning under the strain as I lifted the lid. But it wasn't the contents inside that made my blood run cold. It was the empty space beneath. There, hidden within the chest's hollowed-out interior, was a small metal key. At first it seemed insignificant, just another trinket from the family's past. But the moment I touched it, a sense of dread washed over me. It felt wrong, cold and ancient, as though it had been waiting for me all this time. I looked around the room, searching for any clue as to what this key might open. It wasn't until my eyes fell on a peculiar section of the wall that I realized the truth. There, buried in the shadows, was a door. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, hidden behind a layer of dust and cobweb. The key in my hand seemed to vibrate with an energy I couldn't understand. I knew, deep down, that this was it, the moment I had been searching for. This door was the final piece of the puzzle, the last secret that the Ashford family had gone to great lengths to bury. I inserted the key into the door's lock, and it clicked open with a sound that echoed through the basement. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow passageway that descended even deeper into the earth. A strange, foul odor filled the air as I stepped inside, the walls closing in around me as I made my way down the passage. At the end of the tunnel, I found a room, a small, cramped space that seemed to be nothing more than a stone chamber. But as I stepped further into the room, I saw it a massive stone altar in the center, covered in strange symbols and runes. The air was thick with the stench of something decayed, and as I approached the altar, I saw the remnants of something, no, someone, that had been sacrificed here long ago. The body, though decayed, still had the unmistakable features of a human. It was chained to the altar, its hands and feet bound by rusted iron shackles. But what made my stomach churn wasn't the body. It was the markings carved into the walls around. They were symbols I had seen before in the Ashford family's journals. Symbols that connected the family to something far older, far darker than anything I had ever encountered.
These weren't just occult symbols, they were rituals. Rituals meant to bind something to this place, something ancient. I couldn't understand all of the markings, but what was clear to me was this: the Ashford family hadn't just been cursed, they had made the curse, and they had used this ritual to bind themselves to something they could never escape. As I stood there, the weight of what I had uncovered pressing down on me, the whispers began again. This time, they weren't distant murmurs. They were clear, sharp, and close. I could feel them in my chest, in my head, in the pit of my stomach. They were calling to me, beckoning me to join them. My heart raced as I turned to leave the room, the darkness seeming to close in around me. I couldn't stay here any longer. But as I reached the doorway, something stopped me. The door had vanished. I was trapped. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I could hear them now, chanting in a language I couldn't understand, but felt deep within my soul something was coming, something far more terrifying than I had ever imagined. And there was no way out. The stone chamber felt alive with malevolent energy, every corner seeming to pulse with an unseen force. As I stood in the middle of the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Wait, the walls covered in ancient runes seemed to whisper in a language I didn't recognize, and the remnants of the ritual left behind, a decayed body, the symbols, the altar, told me I had uncovered only the surface of the Ashford family's dark legacy. I knew then that I had to escape. The door had vanished, but something had to be done. The whispers were relentless now, growing louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to drag me into the depths of this curse, into whatever had been sealed beneath the mansion for centuries. My breath caught in my throat as I frantically scanned the chamber. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run, but I knew I couldn't. The answers I had sought for so long were here, buried beneath the mansion, and I had come too far to turn away now. I turned toward the altar, where the body had once been placed. The air around it was heavy, thick with the sense of something ancient, something evil, that had been locked away in this very room for generations. The more I looked at it, the clearer it became. The Ashford family wasn't just cursed by some ancient force, they had invoked it. The evidence was everywhere. The symbols on the walls, the strange rituals they had performed, the bodies they had sacrificed. It was all part of a twisted legacy, one that tied the Ashford family to forces older than human understanding. They had called upon this power, and in doing so, they had bound themselves to it, and now it had taken hold of them. I stumbled backward, my hand pressed against the cold stone wall for support. There was no denying it anymore. The Ashford curse wasn't just a tale whispered in the village or an old family myth. It was real, and it was far worse than I had imagined. I turned away from the altar and forced myself to focus on the present. I needed to find a way out, but the more I searched, the more I realized that the very mansion itself seemed to have become part of the curse. The walls groaned, the floor shifted beneath me, and I could swear I heard something moving just out of sight. I reached the far corner of the room, my eyes scanning the darkness for an escape route, but all I found was more of the same. More runes etched into the stone, more remnants of the Ashford family's twisted path. And then, just as I thought I had reached the end, I found it a door, hidden in the farthest corner of the room. It had been concealed, covered with layers of dust and grime, but it was there. I approached the door cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers had grown deafening, almost maddening, as though they were urging me to open it, to step into whatever waited beyond. With trembling hands, I reached for the handle. It was cold, like ice, and it sent a shock through my body. As I turned, the door creaked open, revealing a narrow passageway that led into complete darkness. The air inside smelled foul, like something decayed, but there was no time to hesitate. The whispers were now unbearable, a cacophony of voices clawing at my mind, urging me to step forward. I had no choice. I stepped into the darkness. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for me to move without brushing against the walls. My lantern flickered, casting weak shadows on the stone floor as I made my way deeper into the earth. The silence was oppressive, but the whispers continued to follow me, growing louder the farther I went. It was as if the very walls of this place were alive, watching me, judging me. The further I descended, the more I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on me. The Ashford family hadn't just hidden their secrets, they had built their entire existence on them, sacrificing everything, even their humanity, to protect whatever lay buried beneath this mansion. I was getting closer. I could feel it. At the end of the tunnel, I found another door, this one larger, more imposing than the last. It was made of thick iron, its surface covered in strange symbols that matched the ones I had seen in the ritual room. The whispers reached a crescendo, almost deafening. As I approached the door, they seemed to be calling to me now, urging me to open it. With a deep breath, I placed my hand on the door's cold surface. The moment my fingers touched it, I felt a surge of energy, dark, powerful, and ancient. The door swung open, with a groan, revealing a massive chamber beyond. What I saw took my breath away. The chamber was vast, far larger than I could have imagined. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with ancient books, scrolls and artifacts that seemed to hum with dark energy. But what caught my attention the most was the center of the room, a massive stone altar, much like the one in the ritual room. But this one was different. It was alive, the very stone shifting and pulsing with an unnatural energy. Atop the altar was something that made my stomach churn, a large, obsidian black crystal, surrounded by strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The crystal was cracked, as though something inside it was struggling to break free. I stepped forward, drawn to it. The moment I neared the altar, the whispers became louder, more frantic, as though the very walls were screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. The truth was right there in front of me. The Ashford family had never just been cursed. They had bound themselves to this thing, this creature, this force that lay within the crystal. They had made a deal with it, and in return, it had granted them power beyond imagination. But it came at a price, and now, that price had been paid. I reached out, my hand trembling, as I touched the crystal. The moment my fingers brushed against it, a searing pain shot through my body, and the room seemed to spin. The whispers became a roar in my ears, and the air grew thick with an unbearable pressure. I tried to pull my hand away, but I couldn't. The crystal was pulling me in, drawing me closer, as though it was alive. I screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the deafening whispers. My vision blurred,
and the darkness closed in around me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take any more, everything went silent. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a voice, low and guttural, full of malice, spoke directly into my mind. "You should not have come here." The silence after the voice spoke was deafening. I stood frozen, my hand still pressed against the obsidian crystal. My heart raced in my chest, and my breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to process what had just happened. The voice, it wasn't like any human voice I had ever heard. It came from deep within my own mind, as though it had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. "You should not have come here." The words echoed in my mind, like a warning, a curse, but they were more than just a simple command. It was as if the very fabric of time had bent and twisted in this chamber, and now the past and present were colliding in a way that I couldn't comprehend. Something ancient, something wrong, had been awakened the moment I touched the crystal. I pulled my hand away, but it was too late. The crystal pulsed with a dark energy, and the room seemed to grow colder, darker. The whispers that had been a constant presence before now intensified, growing louder and more frantic. I tried to step back, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the very ground beneath me had shifted, binding me to this place. The chamber seemed to close in around me, and I felt the walls pressing in, suffocating me. I had to get out, I had to escape. But the crystal, the cursed artifact that had been at the center of the Ashford family's legacy for generations, held me captive. I could feel its power reaching out to me, pulling me deeper into its grasp. And then, like a jolt of electricity, I saw it, the vision that had been hidden beneath the surface, a glimpse into the family's past, their true involvement with the force within the crystal. It began long before the mansion was built, back in the 1600s, when the Ashford family first arrived in North Wales. They were not the noble, respected family they would later become. In fact, their origins were shrouded in mystery, whispers of dark rituals and blood ties that stretched back to an ancient, forgotten order. The family had always been obsessed with power, and their connection to the crystal was born out of a desperate desire to control it. But what they didn't know, what they never understood, was that the crystal was not something to be controlled. It was an entity, an ancient force, that had been trapped for centuries, sealed away in the deepest corners of the earth. The Ashfords had made a pact with this entity, believing they could harness its power. But the price was far greater than they could have imagined. Each generation of the Ashford family continued to uphold the pact, offering sacrifices, performing rituals, and binding themselves to the crystal in ways that were both terrifying and unnatural. The crystal's power grew stronger with each passing year, but so did its control over the family. Over time, the Ashfords began to lose themselves to it, their humanity slipping away as they became more and more consumed by the force they had unleashed. The whispers I heard now were the voices of those who had come before me, their minds twisted by the crystal's influence. The Ashfords were not just cursed. They had become vessels, each one carrying the dark energy of the entity within them. And now, I was no different. The vision faded, but the weight of the truth lingered. The crystal wasn't just a relic of the Ashford family. It was the very source of their power and their damnation. The family had never truly been in control. They had been puppets, controlled by a force far greater than themselves, a force that had been waiting for the right moment to break free. And now, it seemed that moment had arrived. The ground beneath me trembled, and the whispers grew louder, more desperate. I could feel the presence of the entity closing in around me, its malevolent energy pressing against my very soul. It was as if it had sensed that I had discovered the truth, and now it was coming for me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The door that had led me into this chamber was now gone, replaced by a wall of solid stone. I was trapped. There was no escape. Suddenly, the crystal began to glow, its black surface shifting and warping as if it were alive. The symbols that had once been etched into its surface now seemed to pulse with an otherworldly light. The whispers had become a chant, an incantation, a call to something ancient and terrible. And then, as if summoned by the crystal's power, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall, humanoid in shape, but its features were distorted, twisted. Its face was an empty void, its eyes nothing more than black, soulless pit. It wore the tattered remains of what had once been fine clothing, clothes that had long since rotted away, leaving only the outline of a figure. The entity that had been trapped in the crystal had finally been set free. It reached out to me, its hand a skeletal claw, its fingers long and sharp, like the talons of a bird of prey. I could feel its cold, suffocating presence pressing in on me, and I realized with a sickening clarity that this creature had once been human. It was a member of the Ashford family, a long-forgotten ancestor who had been consumed by the very power they had sought to control, and now it had come to claim me. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to back away, but my legs felt heavy, sluggish, as if the very air had become thick with the entity's influence. I had to move. I had to escape. But before I could react, the creature lunged at me, its skeletal fingers wrapping around my throat. I gasped. The breath squeezed from my lungs, but I could feel the power coursing through me, the same dark energy that had once controlled the Ashfords, now coursing through my veins. I fought against it, struggling to free myself, but the more I struggled, the stronger its grip became. The crystal pulsed, its light growing brighter, and I felt my body being pulled toward it, as if I were a magnet drawn to the center of its power. Just as I thought I would be consumed by the darkness, something shifted. A voice, faint, distant, spoke within my mind, a voice that sounded strangely familiar. You can break the cycle. The entity's grip loosened for just a moment, and in that fleeting instant, I broke free. I turned and ran, the stone walls closing in around me. As I sprinted down the narrow corridor, I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to escape. Behind me, the creature's screams echoed through the passageways, a sound that seemed to rip at the very fabric of reality. The Ashford curse had not only claimed its victims, it had now claimed its final host.
I stumbled down the narrow, twisting corridors of Ashford Manor, the walls seeming to close in on me with every step. The sounds of the creature's furious pursuit echoed through the stone halls, and I could feel the oppressive weight of its presence pressing in on me. It was no longer just a figment of the family's past. It was real, and it was coming for me. The whispers in my mind, once faint, had grown louder, merging with the sounds of the creature's pursuit. The voice that had spoken to me earlier, urging me to break the cycle, had grown clearer, and I now understood what it meant. The entity, the Ashford family's curse, had always been tied to the crystal, but the crystal was not merely an artifact. It was a prison, a seal that had bound the entity's power for generations. The Ashfords had unknowingly become the prison's keepers, and now I had been drawn into the web of their mistakes. But the voice had also told me I could break the cycle. The question was how. I glanced over my shoulder as I ran, but there was nothing in the darkness behind me. The creature, however, was close. Its presence hung in the air like a suffocating fog, and I could feel its energy crawling under my skin. It was almost as if the creature was everywhere and nowhere, an entity beyond the confines of this place, yet somehow still tied to it. The house itself seemed to react to its presence, the stone walls quaking with each step the creature took. I couldn't escape. I needed to stop running. I had to face it head on. There was no other choice. Ahead of me, a door, old and weathered, loomed in the dim light. It wasn't like the other doors I had encountered. This one felt different, as though it held a deeper significance. My pulse quickened as I approached it, my heart racing with a mix of fear and determination. There was no turning back. I shoved the door open and stepped into what appeared to be an ancient chapel. The room was dimly lit, with stained glass windows depicting scenes I couldn't fully make out. The air was thick with the scent of old incense, and the floor was covered in dust, the remnants of a once holy space, long forgotten. At the far end of the chapel, an altar stood, but it wasn't just any altar. It was the one from the vision, the one I had seen when I first touched the crystal. On the altar lay a small stone basin, and in the basin, a dark liquid swirled like a storm. I knew what it was. It was the blood of the Ashford family, the bloodline that had been bound to the crystal for generations, each drop a part of the curse that had been passed down through the family. It was the source of the power that had trapped the entity within the crystal, and it was the key to breaking the cycle. I stepped closer to the altar, my mind racing. The whispers had stopped, and for a brief moment, everything was still. The creature's presence was there, but it was no longer chasing me. It was waiting. It knew what I had to do. I reached out, my hand trembling as I hovered over the basin. The moment my fingers touched the dark liquid, the ground beneath me shook violently. The chapel seemed to come alive, the stained glass windows rattling in their frames, as if the very house itself were protesting. The liquid began to bubble and churn, and the altar glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. It was as though the power of the entity was awakening once more. The crystal's pulse grew stronger, its energy surging through the walls of the house. And then I heard the voice again. This time, it was clearer, stronger than ever before. "You cannot destroy me," it hissed. "I am the Ashford legacy. You will never escape." But I wasn't trying to escape anymore. I wasn't running. I was fighting. The cycle had to end, and I was the one who had to end it. I reached into the basin, my hand fully submerged in the dark liquid. The coldness of it sent a shock through my body, and I felt a surge of power course through me. It was as though I was connected to the very essence of the Ashford family's curse. I could feel their pain, their desperation, and their endless struggle to control what they had unleashed. But this time, I wasn't controlled by it. I clenched my fist, pulling a chunk of the dark liquid from the basin. As I did, the room seemed to pulse with energy, the walls shaking as if the house itself were alive. I raised my hand, feeling the weight of the curse in my palm, and then I threw it onto the altar. The creature howled in fury, its voice a twisted amalgamation of anger and fear. The entire room trembled, the light growing blindingly bright, as the energy that had been trapped within the house for centuries began to spiral out of control. "No," the voice screamed. "You cannot." But it was too late. The energy in the room began to collapse in on itself, the walls closing in around me as the crystal's power surged to its peak. The creature's presence flared one final time, and then, with a deafening crash, everything went silent. The light faded, and the altar was gone. The chapel was no longer trembling. The house too had gone still. I stood there, panting, my heart racing in my chest. The crystal's pulse had stopped. The whispers had ceased. The entity was gone. The curse was broken. For a moment, I just stood there, taking in the silence, the weight of what I had done settling over me. The Ashford family's legacy had come to an end, and the dark entity that had haunted them for centuries was no longer bound by their blood. But it wasn't over. Not complete. As the darkness receded, I realized that while the curse was broken, the truth had been revealed. The Ashford family's sins could no longer be hid. The world now knew what had happened in that forsaken mansion, what horrors had been inflicted in the name of power, and what price had been paid to keep the curse alive. The world would remember, but I would never forget. And now, as I stepped away from the altar, I could feel the weight of the Ashford family's legacy shifting. It was a heavy burden, but it was one I would carry with me forever. Because while the curse had been broken, the secrets buried beneath the Ashford name would live on, and they would always be watching. The silence that followed was unnerving. The mansion, once a prison for the Ashford family, and the entity that had tormented them, now stood still as a tomb. The walls that had once echoed with whispered secrets and ghostly footsteps were now eerily quiet, almost too quiet. The faint hum of energy that had once pulsed through the house had vanished, replaced by a deafening stillness that made every breath feel like a violation of the calm. I stood alone in the remnants of Ashford Manor, the air thick with the weight of what had happened. The altar where the entity had once thrived was now just a pile of stones and rubble. The crystal, which had been the source of so much darkness, lay shattered on the floor, its power dissipated into the air like smoke. The creature was gone, but its legacy it lingered in the walls, in the very foundations of the manor, in the ashes of the bloodline that had borne its curse. I didn't know what had driven me to stay,
Perhaps it was the lingering pull of the Ashford name, the need to ensure that everything was truly finished. Or maybe it was the belief that by staying, I could somehow protect the world from the remnants of their dark legacy. Whatever the reason, I couldn't leave, not yet. I made my way through the deserted halls, the floors creaking beneath my feet. As I passed rooms I'd only glimpsed in my vision. The house was falling apart, but it felt like a living entity, still clinging to the past, refusing to let go of the bloodline it had consumed for centuries. These whispers were different. They were no longer warnings or cries of desperation. They were fragmented, scattered remnants of the family's memories, their regrets, their sins. As I walked through the manor, I stumbled upon a small study, tucked away in the far corner of the house. The door creaked open, revealing a room lined with old bookshelves, their contents long forgotten. Dust covered the furniture, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. But what caught my eye was a small leather-bound journal, resting atop a desk, covered in cobweb. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers brushing the spine of the book. Something about it felt different from the others I had encountered. This one was more recent, its pages still pliable, its ink still visible. I opened it, and what I found sent a chill down my spine. The journal belonged to Margaret Ashford, the last matriarch of the family, the woman whose dark rituals had kept the curse alive. Her handwriting was frantic, jagged, as though she had written in a frenzy. The pages were filled with entries about bloodline purifications, forced marriages, and the experiments she had conducted to ensure the survival of the Ashford legacy. But as I read, one particular entry caught my eye. "They are coming for me. I can feel it. The curse is turning against me. The bloodline is failing. I have to fix it before it consumes us all. I must return to the place where it all began." The words were cryptic, but they spoke of a truth I had feared. The curse that had haunted the Ashford family wasn't just a punishment. It was a force of nature, an entity that had been using them as vessels for its own twisted purposes. And now, after all these years, it was turning on them, hunting down the last of the bloodline. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. The realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. The Ashford legacy wasn't truly over. It wasn't gone. It was just waiting for the right moment to resurface, to reclaim what it had lost. And I had been the one to awaken it, to break the cycle that had kept it trapped for so long. I couldn't escape it, no matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to forget. The curse would always find a way to pull me back into its grip. The legacy of Ashford Manor would never truly die. And then, as if to prove me right, I heard a sound from somewhere deep within the manor, a soft creaking, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, the weight of the journal's words heavy in my mind. I wasn't alone. I slowly turned, my eyes scanning the shadows. The air felt colder now, as though the very temperature of the room had dropped. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could hear the faint whisper of fabric brushing against the floor. Then, in the doorway, I saw a figure, a shadow, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that gleamed in the dim light. It was Margaret Ashford. Her face was gaunt, pale and twisted, her features distorted by the years that had passed since her death. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The air around her shimmered with a strange energy, a force that I couldn't comprehend. The curse was not gone. It was alive, and it had taken form once more. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. It was as if the very house had wrapped its fingers around me, holding me in place. I could feel the weight of its history pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, she spoke. "Your blood is tainted." Margaret's voice echoed in my mind, cold and distant. "You cannot escape the legacy. You are part of it now." The words sent a wave of terror through me, but I couldn't move, couldn't escape. The curse had never been broken. It had only been waiting for someone foolish enough to believe that they could destroy it. And now, it had. I reached out, my hand trembling, as I tried to grab the journal from the desk, to find some clue, some way to end it once and for all. But as I touched it, the room seemed to collapse around me. The walls shook, the floor cracked, and the very air seemed to twist with a violent force. The curse had claimed me, just as it had claimed the Ashfords before me. The house trembled as though it were alive, its very walls groaning under the weight of centuries of sin. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the faint hum of something ancient, stirring in the depths of Ashford Manor. Margaret's hollow eyes locked onto mine, her form more tangible now, her presence an overwhelming force that seemed to command every inch of the room. She had been gone for so long, but her curse had never left. The chilling sensation in my chest grew stronger, like an invisible hand gripping my heart, squeezing the very life out of me. I could feel the pull of the manor, its history wrapping around me like chains, dragging me into its eternal darkness. I had once thought that I could escape it, that by uncovering the truth, I could free myself from the nightmare that had plagued the Ashford bloodline for generations. But I was wrong. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, the very foundation of the manor threatening to collapse. The house wasn't just a structure, it was a living entity, alive with the memories of its inhabitants, the ghosts of those who had been consumed by its malevolent force. I could hear whispers now, soft and distant, like a chorus of voices, rising from the very depths of the house. They weren't just the voices of the Ashfords, they were the voices of every soul the manor had claimed over the years, trapped in the darkness, never to escape. Margaret stepped closer, her movements fluid, almost graceful. Despite the unnatural stillness of her form, the room around us seemed to shift, the shadows twisting and contorting, taking on forms that were barely recognizable. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred as I stared at her, her face a grotesque mask of the past, her eyes cold and empty. "You cannot undo what has been done," she whispered, her voice a soft, echoing hiss that sent a shiver down my spine. "The Ashford legacy is eternal. We are bound by blood and cursed by fate. There is no escape." I opened my mouth to speak, to demand why, to question how such a curse could endure. But no words came out. It was as though my throat had been sealed shut, my body paralyzed by the weight of the curse itself. The truth was undeniable. This wasn't just about the Ashfords, this was something much darker. Something older, a force that had been buried beneath the manor, hidden away for centuries. It was the entity that had fed on the family's bloodline, the thing that had driven them to madness and despair. And now, it had come for me. With trembling hands, I reached for the journal on the desk, the leather-bound book that had once held the secrets of the Ashford family. It was my last hope, the only clue that could reveal the true nature of the curse, and how it could be destroyed. But as my fingers brushed the surface, a searing pain shot through my arm, as though the book itself were alive, a living, breathing entity that fought to keep its secrets hidden. I yanked my hand back, gasping for breath, the room spinning around me. I could feel the presence of the curse growing stronger, its grip tightening on me, pulling me into its dark embrace. And then, I understood. The manor wasn't just built on land, it was built on blood. The Ashford family had never been the true heirs to this cursed legacy. They had been chosen, selected by a force far beyond their control, a malevolent power that had bound them to the manor, bound them to the entity that thrived within its walls. The family was nothing more than vessels, puppets in a twisted game of fate. The curse was never meant to be broken, it was meant to endure, to perpetuate itself through every generation, every soul that came into contact with the manor. As the realization hit me, the floor beneath my feet began to crumble. The walls of Ashford Manor shook violently, as though the house itself were waking up, coming alive in response to my understanding. The curse was not just a punishment, it was the very soul of the house, the foundation upon which everything had been built. And now, the house was rejecting me. The lights flickered, and for a moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Behind Margaret, in the darkened corners of the room, shadowy figures began to take shape, spectral forms, pale and gaunt, their eyes empty and staring. They moved toward me, slowly at first, their faces contorted in agony. The souls of the Ashfords, trapped in the house for eternity, were coming for me. They were the price for disturbing their rest, for unlocking the secrets that had been buried so long ago. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, their words unintelligible, but the meaning was clear. I had awoken something I was never meant to understand, something that was far older and far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The curse had been set in motion long before my arrival, and now there was no stopping it. "You have brought them back," Margaret's voice echoed, a low, mocking tone lacing her words. "The legacy lives on, and now you are part of." The walls of the manor began to collapse, stone and wood splintering in a deafening roar. The darkness grew thicker, swallowing everything in its path, until I could no longer see the walls, the floor, or even the shadow. All I could hear were the screams of the lost souls, and the relentless whispers of the curse, echoing in my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. I awoke in darkness, cold and alone. I could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on me, but there was no escape. I was part of it now, bound to the Ashford legacy, forever trapped in the web of darkness that had consumed them all. The last remnants of the family were gone, but the curse lived on. It would never. The Ashford name would always haunt me, and now it would haunt anyone who dared to seek the truth. If this story sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the truth is more terrifying than you think.